There's nothing in Odd Taxi that I would say is bad. There's nothing in Odd Taxi that I would even say is just average. Almost everything in Odd Taxi, from having watched it twice all the way through, is at a bare minimum of good, with a handful of moments that are really good. I realize that the way the previous statements are worded is very awkward. As if I didn't actually enjoy Odd Taxi deep down, but I was talking to someone that really liked it and I didn't want to hurt their feelings, so I put together some sort of reluctant, inoffensive compliment. But really, I do think Odd Taxi is good. Even that denial might sound like another reluctant compliment, but I digress. Since I've started this channel, I've made 17 videos on a decent variety of animes, disregarding a few channel update videos. Technically speaking, this number is actually 18 if we count the Promised Neverland video that was tragically copyright struck a long while ago. But across all of those videos, including some videos where I had to completely scrap the entire thing and start all over again, Odd Taxi has proven to be by far the most difficult in terms of actually finding a place to start writing the script. This title was previously held by the God of High School, but the script for that video kind of sorted itself out once I took the time to read the webtoon. But finding a good place to start with Odd Taxi proved to be so difficult for me that I genuinely considered not making the video entirely and moving on. It wasn't until I attempted to be as straightforward and honest as possible about the whole situation that led us to this somewhat meta introduction that I found to be satisfactory enough to continue on with the project. And this difficulty partially stems from the sheer complexity present within Odd Taxi. We're going to be getting into spoiler territory now, so this is the obligatory spoiler warning. This video will contain spoilers for the Odd Taxi anime, but not for the manga or the movie. Let's clarify this complexity a little bit. When you lay out the story of Odd Taxi on paper, it's not the most simple thing ever, but it's also not that complicated. The general concept is that a girl from Nerima goes missing, and we get pieces to this story through the perspectives and experiences of various characters that are centered around their interaction with the taxi driver Odokawa. Odokawa becomes a suspect in the case and gets involved with some shady individuals, and when money becomes involved over footage from his dashcam, the focus of the story shifts over to the planning and execution of a lottery heist. Not the most simple story out there, but again, it's not headache-inducing levels of complexity either. Rather, this complexity stems from a combination of two factors. The first and lesser of these two factors is the sheer volume of characters and the more independent micro-stories that the anime juggles all at once. The very early moments of the first episode kind of highlights this idea. The short montage at the start begins as the music on the radio kicks in, and in it alone we see 12 different characters. Satoshi, Kakihana, Taiko, Shirakawa, Goriki, all three members of Mystery Kiss and their manager Yamamoto, Dobu, Imai, and ends with Kabasawa. If we want to include Odokawa, then this count becomes 13, and if we also want to include the two comedians Shibagaki and Baba bickering on the radio, then this total count becomes 15. It should go without saying, but that's a lot of characters. Just in that short montage alone, Odd Taxi's revealed more characters than some entire 12-episode animes do in their whole runtime. There's also more characters besides just those that don't show up in the montage, like the two Daimon brothers or Yano and Sekiguchi or Kuroda. Now, if we lived in an impeccable and perfect world, then all of these characters would get a fair and equal level of runtime and treatment to their stories. But we don't, and that's okay. When you comb through each and every one of these characters and their respective stories, there's a high level of variance to the depth of each of these characters' stories, as is the case with most fictional stories that have ever existed. Stories in Odd Taxi can be categorized along a couple of axes. The sheer size and quantity of details is the easiest one to take note of. Then there's also measuring how relevant the story is to the overarching plots of the missing Nerima girl and the lottery heist. If you were to visualize those axes as a graph, then characters would be marked all over the place. Taiko basically doesn't have any story besides being a nice lady who runs a bar that other characters like to visit occasionally. Satoshi doesn't really have a whole lot going on for himself besides being an afterthought tagged onto Shibagaki and Baba's story. Meanwhile, there are other characters who have astonishingly deep stories that just keep going and going. Kakihana is a white gibbon, according to the Wikipedia page, who's down pretty bad on his luck financially and especially romantically. One step he tries to take in remedying the latter situation is by lying about his income on his profile for a dating app, and it's a pretty big lie at that too. He's eventually contacted by a character named Shiho, and according to Kakihana, the two get along pretty well. But what he isn't telling everyone about are the huge loans he's taken out in a desperate attempt to impress Shiho as soon as possible without any plans on how to pay it back. This eventually catches up to him when it's revealed that Shiho is involved in running Badger games. Once Kakihana's lack of money has been exposed, he gets baited and attacked by some not so nice dudes, resulting in him being tied up in a warehouse. It's not like the anime ever depicted him in a bright, shining light at any time, but through his actions you can see this sort of innocent desperation that makes it really sad to watch. Through his few interactions with Shiho, it makes the viewer, or at the very least me, hope that things do work out for him, although deep down inside you know that things aren't as rosy as Kakihana wishes they could be. This eventually peaks at the moment after he's been tied up when he sees Shiho again, and Kakihana essentially begs her to tell him that things really are as he wishes they could be, while she just looks at him with an expression of disgust. Just how absolutely pathetic and desperate his tone of voice gets here is pretty heartbreaking to watch, especially when Yano puts Kakihana's mother on the phone to talk with her son. The absolute length the anime goes to set up Kakihana towards this predictable downfall, yet still being able to make this downfall impactful, works out really nicely because the anime doesn't hold back in pushing him to the floor and kicking him around while he grasps on to his last strings of hope. Whereas Kakihana's story is told in a more expected manner of decently sized chunks of it being scattered across a handful of episodes, Tanaka's is told in a slightly more special manner where about 95% of it is crammed into a single episode, and the remaining 5% or so doesn't show up until like 7 or 8 episodes later. Tanaka is a Puma that works at a game dev company. His backstory is extremely specific and filled with a lot of minute details, but I guess here's an attempt to reasonably summarize it. As a child, Tanaka found himself in a one-sided rivalry involving a classmate over their eraser collections. In an attempt to one-up this classmate once and for all, Tanaka bids for a one-of-a-kind eraser off of an auction site in the image of Donraku, a celebrity within the Odd Taxi universe. He gets into a heated bid war with another faceless buyer, and out of desperation, Tanaka bids 100,000 yen using his father's credit card, which equates to just a little over $820 at the time of this video. His father finds out and beats him for it, and the eraser he bid on never arrives. Fast forward a number of years later, when he's working at a game dev company, Tanaka comes across a mobile game known as Zuden. In it, he learns of a rare animal he can acquire through the in-game gacha, the dodo, which just so happens to be the one rare eraser he owned as a kid before the whole bidding fiasco. He slowly becomes obsessed over the existence of his dodo, paying up tons of money to try and get it until he miraculously does on the way home from work one day. However, just as he pulls the dodo, a taxi drives right by him and causes him to fall over, dropping and breaking his phone. Turns out that breaking his phone at that exact moment caused his game to not properly register the dodo, prompting a dramatic downward spiral. When he gets home, it turns out that his bird died as well, and when he digs up a hole in the park to bury his bird, he finds a gun. When he sees the taxi that caused his dodo to get away, this marks the beginning of his quest for revenge, emboldened by his new weapon, and it just so happens that this taxi is driven by Odokawa. Again, this is an extremely detailed story with details that I both omitted and probably forgot about, but that's the general gist of it. This story takes the entirety of episode 4 to tell and is never touched upon again until you near the very end. Tanaka becomes this crazed gunman who appears once every couple episodes to fire off a few rounds and cause a spike in tension. Now normally I would be the kind of person to whine and bitch about this and say something like they put in so much investment to a character for a whole episode and don't even get the maximum amount of runtime out of them, so what's the point of investing so much time into them in the first place, and etc, etc. But this time around I actually quite like that his appearances are so infrequent. Because Tanaka now becomes this dangerous, deranged, and dodo-deprived gunman hell-bent on revenge, every appearance of his naturally begets a lot of tension. But overusing a device for tension can cause the tension to get, well, not so tense rather quickly, so a very sparing use of his appearances makes him an excellent device for creating rapid spikes of tension, whether that's in his appearance at a cabaret club or initiating a car chase to go after Odokawa and Dobu. When pulling the focus back towards Tanaka's backstory, the actual story itself gets really weird and so specific that I found it essentially impossible to find even a speck of anything to relate to, maybe aside from some minor gacha-related grievances. Once again, I would typically whine and bitch about this and say something like if a character was given so much time to have a really fleshed out introduction, then there should be something that amounts from this that makes me want to care about this character, and etc, etc. But once again, I feel surprisingly okay with this, because whenever he appears, the focus isn't on whatever crumb of development will happen to Tanaka, but rather something along the lines of, oh wow, there's a man with a gun hunting a walrus, or oh wow, Dobu's gotta get his gun back, so these spikes of tension also immediately lead to changes of focus. The anime doesn't treat Tanaka as a character who is meant to experience growth or development until right before the very end, so a lack of attention to his backstory is actually beneficial since it doesn't get in the way of other scenes until the anime carves out a spot specifically for it. It just started fucking hailing outside, so I don't know if that's getting picked up on the mic or not, but if it is, I guess, yeah, that's what it is. It's the hail outside. One thing that I want to mention before I keep going is that Odokawa's personality is rather flat. It's not meant to be a point of criticism, but Odokawa is a pretty unenthusiastic individual, and this subtly helps out a lot in the long run. Odokawa rarely ever gets in the way of the presentation of another character's story by constantly interrupting or interjecting with his inner thoughts. He's more than happy to sit back and listen to people in the back of his taxi talk, which allows for the right and proper presentation of these stories without having them muddied up through the lenses of another character. This kind of detail doesn't typically stand out to me, but I think it's important to call out in the context of the missing Nerima girl plot, since the ultimate goal of it is to figure out not only what happened exactly, but also who might be responsible. So normally this kind of variance in depth of stories doesn't really matter since each character holds a different level of importance to the central narrative. But in Odd Taxi, given that the central narrative is about a murder mystery, suddenly the variance in the depth of stories does matter. Each story could provide a clue towards unlocking some sort of deeper insight into the central narrative towards piecing together the full picture. And given the tendency of Odd Taxi to commonly tangle together stories, every detail in every story begins to matter more no matter the variable amount of quantity in details and quality in stories. The second and more important factor is how a number of these stories manage to mingle together and cross over, which is where a lot of the complexity stems from. If you remember the point from earlier about the axes and the points on which the characters and their respective stories can be graphed along, this is going to be a slight continuation of that point. Characters with a larger size and quantity of details to their story tend to retain more relevance to the two main plots of the anime, but this isn't always a guarantee. To use one of our previous examples, while Kakihana's story is given a lot of spotlight, Kakihana himself, and by extension his story, are not particularly relevant to the overarching happenings. To mention one we haven't talked about, the story involving Homo sapiens, a comedy duo involving Shibagaki and Baba, is entirely irrelevant to the two main plots, unless you want to count Baba being in a relationship with one of the Mystery Kiss girls, but I think that's quite a bit of a stretch. But anyways, given the large quantity of individual stories present, there's quite a number of them that cross over with one another while bringing relevant details and events to the two main plots. In episode 1, the interaction that's given the most amount of attention is the one between Odokawa and Kabasawa. Kabasawa is a hippo who's become very keen on going viral for internet brownie points. He tries to coax an interesting story out of Odokawa in the hopes of turning it into a viral tweet, but since that doesn't happen, he just decides to take a picture with Odokawa and hope for the best. This single photo ends up springboarding the stories of 3 different characters in 3 different ways. The photo Kabasawa took does end up causing him to go viral, but not because he had an actually funny caption to go along with it, but rather because he accidentally also caught Tobu, a wanted gangster, in the background. So Kabasawa latches onto this photo and decides to launch a crusade to hunt down Dobu, fueling a fire of fame through his self-indulgent sense of justice. Now, while Kabasawa talks a big game, he certainly can't play it, but he doesn't need to since all the noise he's generated has drawn a lot of public attention to Dobu. As a result, it's become extremely difficult for Dobu to do anything since so many people now know his face. So now Odokawa has to become a more active agent in the story since he needs to start doing things on Dobu's behalf, such as attempting to track down Kabasawa, which leads to Odokawa officially partnering up with Dobu, which itself leads into Odokawa being able to acquire more concrete evidence of Dobu and Big Diamond's partnership. So yeah, that single photo does a lot of work in not only completely constructing Kabasawa's story, but also in adding more facets to Odokawa and Dobu's stories. My favorite example of stories weaving together is one that starts in episode 1 and ends in episode 12. If we cast our minds back just a little, you might remember me talking about a certain eraser in the shape of Tonraku back when discussing Tanaka. Well, it turns out that this eraser was in the possession of Shirakawa, a nurse who works at the clinic Odokawa frequents. In episode 1, Shirakawa gives this eraser to Odokawa as a gift, and after it goes into Odokawa's shirt pocket, everyone promptly forgets about its existence. Now, if you were someone that was poring over each and every detail after each and every episode, then this would have been something that stuck out to you immediately after episode 4. But for anyone casually watching it like I was on my first time through, it probably would have also slipped their mind just as it did in the minds of most characters. It comes back in episode 12 when Tanaka confronts Odokawa and Dobu at gunpoint. Amidst the tension, the Tonraku eraser slips out of Odokawa's pocket and right into Tanaka's line of sight. During that scene, it's also revealed that Dobu was Ditch 11, or Dichi Ichi Ichi, as they say in the subbed version, which I think has a really nice ring to it. Uh, the original seller of the Donraku eraser that prompted Tanaka's downward spiral. So a couple things here feel a little too convenient at first. Firstly, Shirakawa just so happens to have this legendary eraser that supposedly was only ever manufactured once and is the exact same one that haunted Tanaka all those years ago. Secondly, Dobu also is apparently the key figure in Tanaka's fall. Well, the anime thankfully does provide reasonable explanations for both of these things through some of the other stories that it explored in episodes prior to this one. Shirakawa happens to have the eraser because she dated Dobu in the past, and Dobu gave the eraser at some point. Dobu has this legendary eraser in the first place because his boss, a tapir named Kuroda, knows Donraku, so this eraser eventually made it into Dobu's possession. While this fact is brought up in episode 12, it's also mentioned in a previous episode that Donraku had some ties to criminal organizations. It's not that much of a leap from here to figure that Dobu put it on an auction site to make some quick cash. This is not only my favorite, but also what I consider to be the best example of the woven storytelling present in places throughout Odd Taxi. This story starts through what is a very innocuous moment, leaving several details throughout the story that are important to their respective moments, but also come together by the end to provide an additional storyline that can be put together by taking pieces from multiple other storylines. To go on a slightly related tangent, another thing that's brought up in the final episode is the total number of bullets in Dobu's stolen gun. The gun can carry up to 6 shots at once according to Dobu, and prior to this episode, there were 6 total shots fired. 1 fired into Odokawa's apartment, 2 fired in the cabaret club, 2 fired during the car chase, and 1 fired near Yano's warehouse. Yet in episode 12, Tanaka manages to fire a magical 7th bullet out of nowhere. It turns out that Tanaka only fired 5 shots in total, and that the 6th shot was fired by Little Daimon, who showed up to Yano's warehouse a bit late after receiving intel from Odokawa. I like this bit quite a lot because it causes the viewer to have to question their perceptions of all prior episodes just to make sure that they didn't miscount the total bullets. And surely they didn't, since Dobu literally counted them all out for the viewer moments ago. Whenever bullets are fired, they're all done within separate bubbles of different storylines, and I highly doubt that most people were concerned with counting them. Compiling these little moments scattered throughout many different episodes and stories to create this peak of confusion and tension is done really, really well. Going from one tangent to another, let's talk a little more about Dobu. One thing about his character that I really enjoy is, despite him being a wanted gangster, the anime presents him as this strangely reasonable character that feels like a good guy more often than not. The viewer is inclined to listen to the things he says with a lot more care and attention. I think a lot of this has to do with how Dobu treats Odokawa once they begin conspiring. He's almost always honest and is very willing to sit and discuss things with Odokawa, treating him as a legitimate partner rather than someone he's holding at gunpoint. This automatically generates some degree of respect for Dobu as an individual because of how he treats Odokawa with respect in the latter half of the anime. Now, I do think that Dobu is a little more oblivious than he really should be about Odokawa planning to double-cross him, but it is what it is. Generally speaking, that covers about most of the things I liked in Odd Taxi. There's a few other things, like the visual and sound design that I also liked, but I have nowhere near as much to say about those that I did with previous topics. And as you can probably tell from the tone of the start of this section of the video, we're gonna get into things that I didn't really like. This is a particularly tricky section for me to approach because when you look at most of the anime, these problems aren't present. It's not until the final 2 episodes when these problems appear. And I don't even feel good about using the word problem because only one of these 2 issues is a real problem. The other second issue I have with Odd Taxi is not because of something that is done poorly, but because everything about it feels so, if you'll excuse the wording, oddly done. Let's get through the easier of the 2 issues first. In the latter half of Odd Taxi, the main focus of the story revolves around a lottery heist. $1 billion are on the line, and both Yano and Dobu are competing for it, with Odokawa acting as an accomplice to Dobu while all setting things up in a way to put Dobu behind bars. There's a lot of characters involved in the planning and the lead up to the heist. Imai is taken hostage, Mr. Kiss's manager Yamamoto is forced to play both sides, the 2 Daimon brothers are found helping both halves of the Dobu-Odokawa alliance, and Tanaka is a wild card thrown into the mix. You could even say that Kakihana, the Mr. Kiss girls, and Shirakawa are involved in a less direct manner. And even though there are so many of these pieces being thrown around, Odd Taxi surprisingly manages them in a rather precise and careful way. Most of these characters and the scenes that include them don't feel like they were just thrown in there for the sake of showing up, but instead maintain a consistent level of relevance through the entire process of the planning and lead up to the heist. The main problem isn't present in the events preceding the heist itself, but rather in the actual execution of the heist. Despite the precise and careful nature of the setup, the execution feels really sloppy. As the heist gets carried out, more and more stars need to seemingly align perfectly for things to fall into place. While Odokawa baits Tanaka to come to the parking lot using a GPS tracker, he has to bank on the fact that Tanaka will be there by the time he and Dobu return to the lot. Yano wants to initially check a second case to make sure that it doesn't contain fake bills, but Sekiguchi intercepts just in time by saying that they should check later. Odokawa also banks on the fact that Tanaka will shoot Dobu to put him out of commission so he can set up Imai to come get the money. And if he didn't intend for Tanaka to shoot Dobu, then I don't know what the entire point of him calling Tanaka over is, because Odokawa never really talks about how he's going to double-cross Dobu, just the fact that he plans on doing it. Sure, Tanaka's appearance does create that inevitable spike of tension, but compared to how carefully Odokawa's been in his interactions with others involved in the heist, throwing a random wrench into the machine feels so uncharacteristic of Odokawa given his previous behavior in regards to the heist. Yano clearly knows that Big Daimon is in cahoots with Dobu, but somehow doesn't recognize who Big Daimon is until Dobu gets away with the last real case of money. That last point, after having talked about it with a friend a little, is something that's become of lesser importance compared to the other points, since I think it can be forgiven when considering that the two Daimons are twins, but it still does fall under the category of things that had to go perfectly for the heist to be pulled off. For how precisely everything is plotted out with the actual heist itself, as well as all of the different people Odokawa is hooked up with to create all of these moving pieces, the execution of the heist in real time feels like so much of it is coincidental. A lot of the tension in the execution process was taken out because of this fact, with the most disappointing bit being how dumb Yano and Sekiguchi are because they needed to be dumb for story's sake when they were shown to be extremely cunning prior to this episode. So that was the easier of the two problems for me to discuss. The second one is more or less the entirety of episode 13. Within episode 13, there are two major points revealed to the viewer. The first is that Odokawa, as a result of brain damage caused by a childhood accident, suffers from visual agnosia caused by executive dysfunction. I'm not gonna risk poorly explaining the disorder, so I'll just mention the consequence of it. Odokawa views people as animals. The second major point revealed in episode 13 is the identity of the killer. The person who killed the missing Nerima girl is Sakura Wadagaki, one of the 3 Mystery Kiss girls. Let me just say that I think both of the major points in episode 13 are individually fine. I don't think they are outstanding or mind-blowing, but they're far from being terrible. But both of these reveals feel so out of place in the grand scheme of things. Let's talk about visual agnosia first. It's not like this reveal came out of nowhere and completely blindsided me, because the anime had done its fair share of work to build up to this kind of reveal, with Goriki visiting several people from Odokawa's past. It also explains a few quirks of the anime away, like how Odokawa is the only person to ever refer to others as animals in the flashbacks at the very start, but that's really about the entire purpose this sequence serves. I was under the impression that Goriki was trying to find a reason as to why Odokawa has a hard time sleeping, and maybe there's something that I missed or a medically sound explanation I simply don't know, but I'm not sure as to how these dots are supposed to connect together. The anime treats this reveal as this big shocking thing that we've been building up to because, to be fair, we have been building up to it, but what I ended up experiencing didn't feel as heavy or significant as I think the anime wanted me to feel. It's like the anime forced a question into my perspective that I wasn't really asking, nor was I really that interested in knowing the answer to, and then created this big show to reveal the answer to that question I wasn't really asking. Again, this sequence wasn't bad and it is decently interesting, but I question the inclusion of it overall and what purpose it serves. Moving on to the identity of the killer, I don't have a problem with who the killer ended up being or why they did it, but the entire plot of the murder and the missing Nerima girl ended up taking such a far-off backseat for me once the heist became the focus that the identity of the killer was something I had kind of stopped caring about several episodes ago. This one doesn't feel as questionable or unclear as the visual agnosia part did, since the entire story did technically revolve around this plot at some point despite how sidetracked it got. Furthermore, it's a way to have set up for the movie without needing to munch as much of the movie's runtime, or at least hopefully it won't. It's giving me bad Goblin's Crown flashbacks just thinking about it. The anime's reveal of the killer's identity is done in such an overwhelmingly casual manner for a character that's felt rather unimportant throughout the majority of Odd Taxi that there was no impact or surprise that came with it. Simply put, I was left with no impression of it. Not a good impression, not a bad one, but straight up no impression. Like I said, it's not like the reveal doesn't make sense or anything, because it does, but this sudden jarring focus onto Sakura after the anime giving her rather minimal spotlight just doesn't feel right to me, because it seems like something that was just tacked on at the very end as a double whammy to both close out the anime story, but also to open up the movies. The thing I said about how I had stopped caring about the identity of the killer several episodes prior to the reveal extends out to Odokawa's condition as well. Episode 13 is really dense in a poor way, where everything is sort of dumped onto the viewer at the last minute. As strange as the flashbacks at the start of the anime are, and while credit should be given for Odd Taxi actually taking the steps to answer them, it does feel pretty pointless when looking at the big picture. I never questioned why everyone is an animal, and while the flashbacks were definitely weird in their respective moments, they were something I also wasn't really focused on as the anime went by. Whenever the anime swapped over to Goriki visiting people of Odokawa's past, this became a minor annoyance more than anything else, because it felt like the anime was trying to give me an answer to a question I had never asked, especially in the back half when all the eyes are on the setup of the heist. I can understand this being used as some sort of device to further character development or just show more character for Odokawa, but I think I had a good amount with him by looking at how he interacted with characters such as Kakihana, Shirakawa, and Goriki, and I thought those were all good as well. And even through interactions with characters such as Little Daimon, Big Daimon, and Dobu, we got to see a little more out of Odokawa, and I think that should have been enough. The whole sequence involving the past just feels like the anime overcompensating for something that the anime, I guess, didn't feel like it did enough in. While the identity of the killer is a more relevant plot point when looking at the entirety of Odd Taxi, the anime had long since been sidetracked from that storyline. There's a couple mentions of it here and there in the back half to gently remind the viewer that the main point of the story is about the missing Nerima girl, but I don't think it particularly balances itself well against the heist plotline. Now, to play devil's advocate, there is the telling of Rui's backstory, a character closely related to the missing Nerima girl. This backstory does help reveal some more details about the missing girl, but ultimately it falls under the same umbrella as the final reveals for me, where it feels so out of place when it's shown. I think her backstory itself is actually really interesting, but the timing of it is questionable at best. The reveal of the killer at the very end feels like this forced attempt to refocus the anime back to where it started from. Both of these major reveals in the final episode feel incredibly rushed, especially the visual agnosia one. Odd Taxi clearly wanted to answer all of the questions that it asked, but I think there's value to leaving some questions unanswered. Trying to force the question into the viewer's perception can cause the reveal to come off as very contrived and time-wasting. These forced reveals can also take away valuable time and attention away from the actually important parts of the story at the moment of the reveal. I think that both of these final reveals fall right into those descriptions. The final episode feels entirely dedicated to tidying up a number of loose ends in order to tie together all of the different characters and storylines into a pretty little package, but I don't think it needed this pretty little package in the first place. Because as far as I'm concerned, I think you could completely remove both of the major reveals in the final episode and it wouldn't change much. Of course, there would need to be a little more work done, like trimming out the build-up that leads into these final reveals and probably restructuring the anime to be 12 episodes instead of 13, but regardless of semantics, I think my perspective on the matter should be clear now. Not every single detail in a story has to matter. This is a trap that I've fallen into before in the past and arguably might have again for this video depending on how you view it, or for some people, maybe I completely skirted around the trap a little too carefully. But I think that this statement is something that could be re-evaluated in the context of discussing Odd Taxi or any mystery story in general. The mystery genre as a whole inherently causes details to matter more. It's an inevitable part of the process. There's a question being presented, so pieces of the answer are scattered about for the story and or the viewer to put together before eventually everything clicks into place to reveal the answer. And Odd Taxi does a fine job at that, but it feels like it's surrounded by so much clutter. Now, it is pretty good clutter, and it's not uncommon for mysteries to throw around red herrings to keep the reader or viewer guessing. But there's so much that goes into these individual stories that don't feel as if they contribute to the overarching plot. The impression that I'm ultimately left with is that Odd Taxi was initially created with the goal of taking multiple well-written stories then presenting them in a way that allows them to be woven together in a mostly seamless manner. This is done extremely well. But when it comes to packaging this weave of stories together with some overarching plots, it doesn't quite cross the finish line. The general sloppiness present in the execution of the heist and the very rushed feeling present in the final episode is what really seals this outlook for me. That Odd Taxi feels like lesser than the sum of its parts, even though the sum of these parts is quite large. At the very start of the video, I mentioned that the sheer complexity of the anime is partially the reason why finding a foothold to start this video with was so difficult. Well, the lasting impression that I've been left with after the final episode is the rest of the reason why this project has been so difficult for me to pull together. If you just look at the things I said for episodes 12 and 13, then it might seem like I don't really care for this anime, which isn't true. I'm not going to let my biases about the ending get in the way and say that Odd Taxi isn't good or that it doesn't deserve all the accolades I've seen of it. Odd Taxi is pretty good, and despite juggling a lot of different things, it also handled most of them really well. I can see a lot of the reasons why people enjoyed it so much. There's just that little itch in the back of my brain that's constantly circling around the ending of Odd Taxi that's always reminding me about how it didn't quite sit right with me. As I'm writing this, I'm constantly being plagued by this feeling that I'm not judging Odd Taxi on a fair basis, that no matter what I write about the ending, it's not going to feel correct to me. And as weird as that seems, I think that's where we're going to end this video. No matter how many circles I run around this ending, I'm never going to come to a conclusion I feel satisfied with. And I think that the best and only thing I can really do about this is to simply leave things be and put the ending to rest. Okay, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and maybe subscribing to the channel. Every little bit helps out a lot. For small channels such as mine. We recently broke 100 subscribers actually, which is pretty cool. It's not a huge number, but it's also not super insignificant either. So yeah, thank you for everyone, I guess, that's subscribed so far. I just had a couple additional thoughts about Odd Taxi that popped up while I was editing that I couldn't fit into anywhere in the video, so here they are. Odd Taxi is good at rewarding viewers that really paid keen attention to little details, such as the Donraku eraser thing I talked about. You don't need to notice every single little one of these details to enjoy the stories for what they are, but becoming aware of them and seeing how they become relevant later on makes certain moments more enjoyable. I think this gives some special merit towards rewatching the show. I quite like Yamamoto as a character. For a refresher, that's the manager to Mystery Kiss, the idol group. He's put in a unique position where he has to be manipulated by both Yano and Odokawa, but he allows it to happen because he seems to genuinely care about protecting Mystery Kiss, which also makes the moment that he lashes out against Odokawa have a little more impact too. The anime does a great job at depicting this character as somebody stuck between a rock and a hard place. The thing living in Odokawa's closet is an interesting way to add mystery to his character. The anime really heavily leans towards this being the missing Nerima girl, but never overemphasizes to the point where it basically is all but confirmed and basically drains all the suspense out of any mentions of the closet. And because of the anime pointing towards the thing living in the closet being the missing girl, it adds a shade of doubt to Odokawa's motivations too. Of all the individual stories in the anime, Shibagaki and Baba's is probably my favorite that I've never really talked about. I think I probably should have put it in over Tanaka, talked about them instead of Tanaka, but Tanaka does have more story relevance, so I think I made the right decision. I do like Kakiana's story better than Shibagaki and Baba, so yeah, I think I made the the right decision in the long run. But I think Shibagaki especially is a really cool character because of how the anime portrays him as a bit of an asshole at the start, which slowly transitions into the viewer feeling bad for him because of Baba's unprecedented success that seems to quite literally come out of nowhere. I especially enjoyed how he's essentially begging Baba to keep working with him after the two of them get into a fight, which goes to show how the power dynamic in the relationship has shifted, with Shibagaki being the one to push around Baba at the start and him basically being at the mercy of Baba by the end. I also really like the few instances where the anime uses banter from their radio show in the background as ambient noise instead of music. Makes the atmosphere of those scenes just a little more interesting. So that's it for the Odd Taxi anime. About the movie, yeah, I'll probably watch it, but no video. I enjoyed the anime enough that I could see myself taking a couple more hours out of my life later on to watch the movie, so that's the thing. The actual next video is going to be Zombie Land Saga Revenge. Cursory notes for it are done, but I do need to go back and rewatch the original and then rewatch Revenge again to see if there's anything that's changed since... Fuck, I guess it has been like almost a year since it's been out, hasn't it? God, that fucking Gridman video ate up so much of my time. But that's it. Yeah, that's it for real. Once again, thank you for watching. That'll be it for me, and yeah, take it easy.